So, this is a fun one. This is really a fun one. This is Empire Prepares, and this was... Well, it's the first of the September Patreon premieres. So, I realise we're in September, we've been in September for a while, and this is the first one, and, you know, hey-ho. It's also going to go live at the same time as the November Patreon suggestions go live, so if you want to suggest topics for November, you're more than welcome to. That's all available on Patreon. There should be a link around here somewhere. There's a link in the bottom of the description of this thing, but also there is a link in up there as well, usually, I think. Morrison. When I come to you, I am on this side of the screen, so it should be above my head. It should be, he says. I get confused sometimes with keep changing offices. So today's question is pretty much about what happens if Britain and Britain specifically, but I will be talking about other nations because these things never happen in a vacuum, takes a more proactive approach to defense and security in the 1920s and 30s. Now, why do I do alternate histories? Why do I allow alternate histories when I'm a historian, when I'm my PhD's in war studies, when I spend my life teaching history? Why do I do alternate histories? Why do I discuss them? Well, there's two reasons. One, to discuss an alternate history properly, you have to really learn the history. And therefore, it's often a good question to ask students of, why didn't this happen? It's not, why did X happen, but why didn't they do Y instead? Why did they? It's a way of saying why did they do X, but it forces them to go around and look at more information and actually think through not just the benefits of X, but also the benefits of Y and the negatives of X and the negatives of Y, and balance them and try and figure out what the thinking was. Because often when we see that decision-making process, when we see what they could have done as an options and what they have chosen, that gives us a better understanding of what their thought process of those making decisions was, and it gives you a better position to start from to understand it and understand what their thought process is behind other things they do. So that's basically the point. And to sum it up another way, and to literally read it off the screen in front of me, but that is what I wrote, and I thought I wrote quite a good one, actually, I have to admit, because historians exist to try to look not just at the who, the what, the where and the when, but also at the why, which is often the most difficult and subjective to piece together, as we rarely have it explained. And even if we do have explanations, they are often selective in what they choose to focus on or how they choose to portray things. Whys matter. Whys are where some of the lessons lie. They're also where a lot of contentious and subjective arguments lie. And usually it's where someone, especially people seeking to make a name for themselves, will try and take a most extreme perspective on the why. And most people don't think like that. Yes, there are some who think in that way, in such a binary extreme ways, but it's very rare. Usually it's a lot of subjective thinking, and it's a lot of their own locus going forward. And sometimes as a historian, if you want to understand a decision, how decisions were made in, let's say, the 1940s, in World War II, you have to look at the decisions that were made in the 1930s, 1920s, 1910s, and you have to look at how they made the decisions and why they chose the paths they did. And sometimes the best way to understand why they choose X is to examine why they didn't choose Y. And to examine that, you first need to be able to make the case for Y. You can't understand why something wasn't chosen if you just list its negatives, because then you're pretending like it never had a chance. You have to be able to understand its positives. And that's where all the alternate history work comes in. So even the most purist historian who will never countenance talking about alternate history, they have to postulate alternate history in their heads. They have to consider it, because otherwise they can't understand, they can't get a fully rounded perspective on what they're talking about or what they're thinking about. They won't like me saying that, those particular historians, but it's a simple case. You just can't do it without first examining what the other options were, and you have to think through what the likely consequences of those options were, because that's what the people at the time were doing. It's like when you're making a decision at home. If you, let's say, have an option of spending money on a trip out, let's say to a theme park, saving the money and just spending the day at home on your own, or spending the money on a computer game, or spending the money on, let's see, what I'm spending a lot of money on the moment, IKEA bookshelves. Kalaxs specifically, they're gorgeous. You don't sit there and go, just think about the theme park. You also think about, well, what's the option? If I get the Kalaxs, I can organise this mess and get all the stuff out of the boxes, which is really helpful. If I just stay home and don't spend any money, then I do nothing all day, just stare at a wall. That sounds rather boring. If I buy the computer game, that's hours, potentially days, weeks, months of entertainment. Plus, there's also the interaction I can get from playing with my friends online, and the chat, the examples there. And in my case, the potential income or work I can get because I do it on Twitch, and who knows, someday my gaming talents might be recognised, and I will be the #1 world gamer in things like Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts and a few other computer games. I doubt it's ever going to happen because, let's be honest, I'm not good. I really don't enjoy first-person shooters, and they seem to be the popular ones. But you never know. You never know. Maybe my cool, historically accurate rendition of ships, which I tend to try and put together in that game, in especially UAD, will pay off. Or I go to the theme park and have a fun time, maybe with a single friend. We just go for a wander around. Or maybe I organise a group of us going to the theme park. And that becomes a memory that is one of those memories I'm thinking about on my deathbed. As a great time I had. Or instead, we could save the money. You have to think these things through. And it's the same with decision-making process when you're making decisions for government investment and spending. And it's the same, and therefore the historian has to go through the same to understand why those things were chosen. So this is why alternate histories have value. Now, today's split. I've decided to go with treaty compliant, economic focus, treaty compliant, security focus, and treaty selective. At no point have I gone for a scenario where there is no treaty. This is an alternate history. This is not me going off on fantasy fleets. Historically, they went with the treaties. So this is actually quite a good idea to think through of how compliant were the British with the treaties. Did they go with an economic focus and go, when the treaty... we could do these things under the treaty if we have an economic focus. Or security focus while being treaty compliant. Or did they have a selective approach to the treaty? In fact, what'll be interesting is I will go through what going the full route down on any of these particular emphases entails. And then I'd love the question at the end is going to be literally, what was the British approach to the treaty most like? Was it a selective approach? Was it an economic focus approach? Was it a security focus approach? Was it a combination of all three? Or was it completely treaty compliant with no at all going, these things are justifiable and we can get away with them? Because basically, these are differing levels of... And I say this with all due respect and politeness, these are differing levels of the British paying less and less observance of the strict rules of the treaty, or rather, being very observant of the wording of the treaty and making sure they interpret that as well as they can for their own ends. Which, if we consider water-filled armour, or rather, we'll get into that, it could be said to be rather historically accurate. And honestly, some of the things I talk about, you will go, well, hang on, they did versions of that. They just didn't go to that full extent, and they did versions of that. And that's the point. If you're going with an economic focus, you might do X. But if you're going with a security focus, you might do Y, or you might do X plus 1. Or X plus Y. And if you're being treaty selective, you might do X plus Y, but do it via a slightly different methodology. And the interesting thing, of course, is some scenarios there is a lot of rich material for us to draw from for what the British could have done, because it's what they did in certain places already. It's just doing it on a wider scale. So, Shameless book plug, and it's roughly 10 minutes 40. So, I always do a Shameless book plug. I do a Shameless book plug like I do a question every single video, and or at least try to. And the Shameless book plug is a simple thing, really. I'm a naval historian. My research is entirely funded by you. My ability to get promoted as an academic when I'm teaching universities is also entirely dependent on you, because guess what? In the UK, book sales and journal article citations are the critical things for getting permanent roles and for getting promoted and even getting hired as a contract lecturer or a guest lecturer or invited to conferences as a speaker or something like that, or all those things. And all those things I do, the book comes first. So thank you to everyone who's bought copies. Thank you to everyone who might buy copies. I would love you to please buy a copy, because this is the Travels, Battles and Darings, and currently it's my only book, but there are more coming out soon. If everything with the move goes slightly more to plan, and I have slightly less time with a loud drill and a loud sander going yee, or you might have heard the sander in the back. It's still been going all morning. It's so frustrating not being able to do it myself. But yeah, this is the book I have out, and it's the Genesis of the Modern Destroyer, at least from the Royal Navy's perspective. I do always emphasise that it's from the Royal Navy's perspective, and there were limitations. Like, I have managed to visit Canada or Australia and look at their archives and look at some of their materials, but I've done that after COVID, and this was published during COVID. And I couldn't do those travel trips during COVID. So, if there's enough sold, I get another version. If I get another version, another edition, then I can maybe add in some extra chapters, and that's something I would really love to do. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. That's all down to all of you, and thank you for your support and your help again. Thank you. As I said, everything that happens research-wise, in terms of publications, in terms of work, is down to your support of the channel, your support of through Patreon, through Super Chats, all those things. Thank you. And at the moment, as I've mentioned, I'll be discussing again later, I'm currently in the middle of, well, all money raised goes towards Kalaxs! And I'm also later going to give you a quick discussion of how I'm building my home network, because I know different people have different ideas about it, and I just thought I'd add in mine, despite not being, well, no longer being an IT technician. I haven't been one for many, many years, but I'm going to be building my own home network and wiring up my own plugs, or other cable sockets. So let's start off with treaty compliance. And we'll start off with the naval construction, because that's the easiest area to go for. Cruisers and sloops. Honestly, if you want a treaty-compliant economic focus, and you want to do something which is entirely about economic protection, both in terms of yards and in terms of the wider empire, security and economic warfare and protecting trade, you want sloops and you want cruisers. And you can build those. So under the Washington Treaty, under the London Naval Treaty, cruisers get more limited under the London Naval Treaty, but under the Washington Treaty you can build as many as you like, so realistically you should be cranking out counties. 4 to 8 a year, the British should be doing. Full fat counties. It's a really interesting scenario if that does happen, because if we think about it, they laid down 5 in 1924, they laid down 2 in 1925, 2 in 1926, 4 in 1927, and they were laying down some more after that. They cancelled them in 1930, so the Surreys are cancelled then. And of course they build the cut-price counties, which are definitely not as good in any way, shape or form. They're good ships, but they're not as good as a full fat county. It's always a weird conversation you get into because people listen to, especially the experience of HMS Exeter, but also York, and they go, look at these ships, look at what they do, they're amazing, and you go, but they're not. The ship's crews and the action they do are really good, but imagine what they could have done if they'd been a full fat county doing that fight. If it had been one of the proper ones. And that's when they sort of look at you and go, what do you mean? Well, they're building those instead of these. And these are what they should have been built. So, historically, they build 13. But if you had gone with, let's say, just 4 every year from 1924 onwards, because you can build as many cruisers as you like, ships under 10,000 tons or under, you could build, there were no cumulative restrictions. The British could have had 4, 1924, 4, 1925, 4, 1926, 4, 1927, 4, 1928, 4, 1929. By the time the London Treaty came in, they could have been 24 of those cruisers. 24 county class. Now, that does have an interesting impact, because that means immediately you're going to have to start readjusting figures for your London Naval Treaty and cruise limits. But the thing is, no one's going to fall. You're not going to get rid of them. It might get rid of the Hawkins earlier. You might not have them around. And if you really want to max out, as I said, you could be building as many as 8 happily a year. There are the yards for them. There is the space, that's going to keep your yards going. And then you think about that, well, that will be 48 counties. And so what does the treaty then become? Does the treaty at that point become 500,000 tons of heavy cruisers and 500,000 tons of light cruisers? So Britain's able to have 50 heavy cruisers and 50 light cruisers of up to 10,000, well, 50 vessels up to 10,000 tons in each category. So, interesting scenario. Might actually give Britain enough cruisers for the missions it wanted to do them. Could be really interesting with America as well in terms of cruiser buy. Also could have a really interesting impact on everyone else, but the thing is, this is going to have an impact, and this would have kept the British yards going quite happily. If you're ordering that many cruisers, okay, they're not the same as capital ships, but you've got that much regular throughput, you're going to keep the yards, you're going to keep the armour, you're going to keep the gun production, all these things going at a level that it works. And then if you add in sloops are in many ways better than destroyers, because you've got a whole host of destroyers, but you need to keep the same yards which are going to keep destroyers and produce destroyers en masse going. And you also want to build vessels which can provide your merchant escorts, your escorts of merchant ships in wartime for convoys, and you want to build patrol vessels, minesweepers. Sloops have so many different roles, oceanography, all these things. Again, you can justify quite easily building 8 a year. You can justify quite easily giving them out to nations such as Australia, giving them out to nations such as India, giving them out to, when I say nations, dominions, parts of the empire, which are growing up and are on their way, because again, the British are still going through, this scenario does not change the British decolonisation plan. Yes, it's a very long-term plan. The British are transforming the empire into the Commonwealth. But the sort of idea you're talking about in that scenario, in that strategy, is a long-term plan. But how do I put this politely? One of the curious things about the British with their plan to try and change the empire, and it's the reason they have that plan, it's one of the reasons why the British do produce the Commonwealth after the empire, and it's kind of a weird scenario that we've got. Think about how many empires there have been in history. How many have ended up with a fraternity of nations who get together and hold regular sporting events and have political dialogues and economic agreements and all sorts of other get-togethers and friendships, still with a nation which was the empire, and actually an organisation which actually other nations have sought to join even though they weren't part of the empire. That doesn't happen by accident. That was part of the long-term plan to produce it, although it was going to be slightly more linked. So just think of something which was, to an extent, was supposed to have the economic free trade thing of the European Union as well, out of the European Economic Common Area, etc., attached to those sort of things as well. But that's not today's discussion. But they are moving these nations towards nation state. A good way to start them off is to give them navies, and a good thing for a navy to start off with is a sloop. It's a really good thing. A training cruiser is also a good thing for training personnel, so you can maybe hand over some Hawkins class for that one, so the ones which don't have those. But if you're talking about Australia, they already have cruisers. New Zealand already has cruisers. So giving us some sloops is a good thing, and also they could buy them and build them themselves. You could start with all of this. You could use this as a stepping stone to start growing industry and the economic capabilities of these parts of your empire, which is good, because security in many ways comes from infrastructure, and infrastructure comes from the industry and that you have available at a location. So if you have a good maritime industry, you'll have good maritime infrastructure. Good maritime infrastructure, your navies can make use of that. So if you can start off with construction, you can also start off by, let's say, having the sloops go and have, especially the sloops, go and have repairs done in, let's say, Freetown, Sierra Leone, and other parts of Africa and the Caribbean, and you can start building these things up. Which brings us rather neatly to the next point. Infrastructure. Now, if you're going for treaty-compliant economic focus and infrastructure, the thing you should be investing in around the world is dry docks. It's very simple. Dry docks. And other port facilities, cranes, etc. Things which are going to boost the economy. Now, there's also some railway lines you should probably be investing in, which is kind of a strange thing to say for maritime infrastructure, but the thing is, you need to have some level of redundancy with your investment, and some level of efficiency. So basically, you're going around boosting up the yards, boosting up the ports, boosting up the facilities which are key to your global economic presence. And by growing them, and growing the facilities which support them, the railway lines which bring raw materials into them, etc., or their own export goods, etc., you are strengthening yourself. This is what you should be doing. Okay? This is what you should be doing almost anyway. You should be investing in this infrastructure anyway if you're a nation state. But when you're an empire, you have to bring along not just yourself, but also your colonial authorities, your dominion governments. You have to bring them all and get them all in agreement to invest in infrastructure. You have to incentivize them along. And you want to develop that infrastructure. You want there to be large port facilities in Australia that can handle many ships, because you want to be able to get the raw materials from Australia when you need it in wartime, but also those same port facilities which are there to allow for easy access for merchant ships can be filled up with warships should they need to in wartime. And before you start thinking about going, well, Alex, the merchant wharfs, they have all these cranes along, why are you going to need those warships? Just think how useful those big heavy-duty cranes can be in loading things like ammunition on a battleship. Even a cruiser with its 8-inch shells and 6-inch shells, those cranes can be very, very useful in getting that stuff aboard. And so this is what you have to start thinking through. Okay, if we're not doing the first order security because we're limited by treaty, what's the stuff below that sustains it, that we can get up to a level so we can quickly build this up on top of it? Dry docks. They are a useful thing in peacetime and in war. And in fact, If Britain had gone around and carried on its investment in dry docks like it had carried on prior to World War One, and invested in those docks, then the situation in World War Two would have been very different. But you needed to invest. And the trouble for Britain is you need to invest empire-wide. You really have to realise that. Sometimes we have some very interesting discussions where people focus in and go, well, Britain says they can't, the Britain's not built, is defining what they're building the battleship is by this size. So that means they can't build a ship bigger. No. They've looked at the average size of dry docks across the empire. They've gone, this is how many dry docks we have in this place. This place we think we might be fighting a war over in the Pacific. What dry docks do we have currently? Boom. Because the thing is, you can't plan your fleet for the dry docks you plan to build just in case the government stops the funding. You have to plan your fleet for the dry docks you have. Again, this is where infrastructure investment comes in handy, because if you're investing in bigger, better dry docks around the empire, that's going to help you in wartime, because it's going to help you with having spaces to repair ships, and it's going to help you with construction, because it's going to have more spaces you can build ships, but also, if you're in British Empire, it's going to help you with freeing up your options for construction, because you're going to be going, well, we can build to this size now, because there's about half a dozen yards over there which can fit that in. Yeah, that makes life things a little easier. Often interesting discussion I have on this one, by the way, is with people who then point out and go, well, surely the US faced the same thing with operating ships in Southeast Asia, etc., what the dry docks were. The American plan was to get their ships back across the Pacific. Or to Hawaii. They had their own territories and they had their own dry docks and they could build their own facilities. Think about where the British ships have to go. They have to go across the Pacific and then across the Atlantic. They go one way around the world. Or they have to go around the Indian Ocean, through the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Or if the Mediterranean is blocked, then they have the Indian Ocean, South Atlantic, North Atlantic to get home to the big yards in Britain. It's a slightly different scenario and circumstance for your ship. And really, infrastructure-wise, it shows the issues for Britain in that they invested actually in infrastructure in Singapore. They did invest in infrastructure, but they didn't, and they had plans for investing in the defences, but they didn't invest properly in the defences. They didn't invest in enough infrastructure in enough places. Historically, they focused it on certain areas, and honestly, they should have spent more and done more areas. But the infrastructure they did spend money on, they then cheaped out on the defences of. Which leads us to treaty-compliant economic focus, fortifications, and garrisons. Here is the thing. If you spend the money on the infrastructure, spending the money on the fortifications and garrisons is part of that spending. It shouldn't be treated as a separate thing. It should be treated as part of that, because it's about guaranteeing its availability in wartime. Spending money on a whole lot of infrastructure, and the British do spend a huge amount of money on infrastructure. They build masses of fuel storage facilities around the empire that store so much ship fuel, it's obscene. We're talking more was stored than almost was needed to run World War II for the British Empire. It's a huge amount, and there are stores all over the place, and there are still, by the way, good trick if you're wandering around a place and you're not sure if you were in the British Empire or not, your territory, go to the nearest medium-sized port. If there are some legacies of some concrete-ish looking circular foundations and concrete foundation sort of things, and circular concrete foundations, they are probably a legacy of the British fuel stores, because many of them were built out of very interesting 1920s concrete in parts, and you can still find them. It's very flinty concrete, usually as a rule. That will tell you the British Empire were there. They literally built fuel stores. So many places. So they built the infrastructure to support the fleet operations. They didn't build enough dry docks, but they did upgrade some, and they did have some floating ones and this and that. But then they cheap out on the defences. Someone has a cunning plan. Because no one would attack us! What I love specifically about history is sometimes you look at the rhetoric used by people in the late 1930s and the beginning of World War II discussing space on the world, and the same people were politicians involved in making decisions which directly undermined their security. And they're talking about these wonderful bastions and fortresses, and no, you didn't put in all the guns that were assessed as being required. In fact, it gets worse when you realise that the original request for guns was twice the number. You then cut it down, and then you cut that by half, and then they put in the guns, and before they've just sort of finished part of the guns, and they're going to, and then you cut cut one more part of it. You cut it again. Because, they're never going to be attacked from the landward side. You sit there and go, literally, you have had the finest engineers and naval officers and army officers you have available. Go to Singapore, write a plan and put it together. And tell you what they think is necessary. And then you, in your infinite wisdom of mostly the Treasury, have cut that by half. And now you're telling them, not only are we cutting the number of guns by half, we're also cutting a core part of the fortifications because we don't think you're right when you say it's necessary. What was the point in sending them in the first place? You've kind of wasted the money. Now, there are lots of positions around the world to fortify for Britain, and if you're doing this from an economic focus, you should be thinking about your key trade routes. So, Gibraltar, Malta, Alexandria, Suez, Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as we call it today, Singapore of course, but also Cape Town, Falkland Islands. Somewhere in the Caribbean, which is close enough to monitor the Panama Canal, but not so close that the Americans are going to get particularly feisty about it. You should be making sure these places have suitable facilities on them. Now, if they are in the Caribbean, you might not be talking about heavy guns, but you can probably get away with 6-inch guns and going, well, we need it for defence against, surface raiders. And the Falkland Islands, well, that's pretty much your own base down in the South Atlantic. And that cannot look like it's useful for anything, but it is very useful as enough way round into the Pacific and enough way for key routes to get around. So basically, you probably should be investing in some sort of air base, an airmail route, and some sort of garrison presence for it. Honestly, some 9.2-inch guns would be good, but let's be honest, you need more of those everywhere. And this is one of the interesting things about the British in this period. They're not producing enough of these things. They can do. They have the infrastructure. They have the companies crying out for work, but the focus of the British government from the economic perspective is incredibly focused in on paying back the debt as quickly as possible. And basically, they have the war to end all wars mentality about the Great War, about the First World War. And then in the 1930s, they start to have a crash build program where they try and rectify a lot of the issues they've created, but they've still got some of the same problems which they generated up, which was people going around paying to close down shipyards. Why was the government paying shipyards to close down, you might ask? Well, it's quite simple. The idea was, at that time, that Britain had too many shipyards, and that they were taking too many skilled personnel away from other sectors. And that the waterfront space could be used for other things of economic viability, even though most of them they shut down and they were then not done anything with, and some of them are still in empty states to this day. The ones that were shut down by it. A couple of them haven't even been redeveloped for houses. They're literally just empty. That was the smart plan, and that came out in the 1920s because it was also felt by some that if you cut down some of the shipyards, etc., and these sort of things, you'd focus the economic growth on the yards that really could boom, and which is always a sensible thing. Government getting involved in deciding which yards are going to be the economic boom and which are going to economically boom and which are not. I mean, it's brilliant. I love that when British talk about being a laissez-faire economic policy government in the 1920s and 30s, and you go, but you're literally getting involved in some industries to tell companies, we'll pay you to close down because we don't think you're going to go anywhere. It's stupid. It's stupid. But that's life. Which takes us to the summary part, because, leaving aside the National Shipbuilders Security, which was promoted by the Governor of the Bank of England at the time, and that was the organisation which went around buying yards and placing covenants on them saying they couldn't use the yards, and the government's policy towards trying to pay ship owners to build, at the same time the government was doing a system of paying ship owners, and this is merchant ship owners, to replace old tonnage with new tonnage to try and help the yards. There's fun things going on at this period. If you want to look up something really interesting, a really piece of interesting history, look up the Yarrow March. It's a fun time. But pretty much, if you had further investment, if you had a constant economic investment of shipbuilding, etc., you'd have probably had some very interesting scenarios. It's like Palmer's is a good example. They were one of the best shipyards in the UK for building small ships. If you'd kept building sloops the whole way through the 20s and 30s, along with destroyers when they started building them in the 30s, then the odds of Palmer's, which went bankrupt, going into receivership, is very, very low. There are other companies like Beardmore's, honestly. Them going out was a big surprise, because Beardmore's were one of the very, very finest yards in the UK when they were opened in 1906. They've been one of the most, how do I put this politely, most advanced yards ever conceived in Britain in their time when they're built, and then they are bought out by the National Shipbuilders Security. And these things happen because of the impact of the treaties and the government's economic policy. And the government's economic policy is to always put as much money back into paying off the debt as quickly as it can do. This is, by the way, a debt which we didn't succeed in paying off till about the 1990s. That was the debt from the First World War, and then there was the debt from the Second World War after that, and all these things. And one of the things the government really does is almost an austerity policy whilst trying to do some form of social security, i.e. land fit for heroes ideas start coming out as well in this period. And that's why they're focusing the economics where they are. But in many ways that's a very short-term economic policy, because it's dealing with the immediate problem while sowing problems for the future. If you are providing a baseline of naval construction and investing in infrastructure, those two things will help the economy grow. They'll help keep the economy going in peacetime, but also provide enough employment. Because if, let's say, a firm is already building a cruiser for the Royal Navy and has got a contract for a couple of sloops as well, that's probably enough money to keep enough building coming in to keep that yard at least solvent for a year. And while it's solvent, it can bid for other projects, for merchant ships, and it's going to bring down the cost of merchant ships. And also, the cost of the warships themselves will go down, because if there are more people ordering, if you're ordering more ships, there's more construction going through, there's more throughput going into the system. There's going to be able to keep more providers, more builders, more of the armor manufacturers going. In which case, there's going to be competition with them. Once you have monopolies, that's when people can start charging outrageous profits. Ultimately, this policy would have seen a far stronger economic position, probably for Britain, in any World War II scenario. It would have seen them have far more sloops for convoy escort work, so probably might not have had to do the same crash build on the Hunt-class escort destroyers and Flagg-class corvette programs, so those programs might have been shifted to something else, because you already had the ships available, you already had the hulls in the water to do that. Or you still might have done them, but let's be honest, you're starting from a far larger number, a far broader strength, in which case you can grow even more quickly, and those convoys can have more security a lot more quickly, which is going to have an effect on the early wolf packs before they get up to full strength. And you can also, with the extra cruisers, that's going to help you with various all the sinews of war. But most importantly, if you've pushed this economic policy, you're going to have a far greater base to start from when you're rearming in the 1930s, which is going to speed up things like capital ship procurement, aircraft carrier procurement, and even probably aircraft themselves. It's going to give you a greater baseline to work from. And who knows what effect that does, because that happens, because the whole thing is, if you have more forces, if you have greater forces, do you concentrate greater numbers on the operations as they historically happened, or do you do other operations as well? You have the options. You will make decisions with the resources you have available. If you have more resources, your decisions that you make will change. So, let's consider the security focus one, the next section. Now, this is where things get interesting when you have a security focus, because, look, if I was being very, very cruel, and I know the treaties specifically do state that, you shouldn't be procuring a submarine for mercantile warfare, attacking merchant ships, etc., and that's part of it. And X1, of course, looks like, on the face of it, like it might be a mercantile warfare vessel, which is why you don't procure more of them. But I'd like you to rethink that, because you see, as an empire, which Britain was, you need a range of gunboats. You truly do. You need a range of gunboats. And what you are seeing here is a submersible gunboat of a specialist type needed for empire policing. And realistically, the Royal Navy should have probably procured about 2 to 3 dozen of them. Yes, because, that would have been a useful complement of gunboats for specific parts of the world. Right, under Washington, if you're taking a not just economic, purely for keeping the yards going, providing that baseline employment, and also servicing justifiable security needs, but you're taking the approach of, we need to be secure, we need to invest, because whilst we hope a war is not going to happen anytime soon, we have no faith it won't. Well, under Washington, you can pretty much build anything that's not a capital ship or a carrier. Britain can even build 2 capital ships, but leaving that to one side, you can build cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats, submarines, sloops, auxiliaries. The only limit is they can't be over 10,000 tons. And Britain could, conceivably, build a version of an escort carrier, or a scout carrier, or what they probably call it at the time. At the time, they were working with what they were calling a cruiser carrier role, which was a carrier to operate with cruisers for reconnaissance and maritime trade protection, and those duties. Now, conceivably, you can build something for under 10,000 tons that can carry 18 or so aircraft and do just that. After all, Hermes is only just over that limit. If you are building enough County class, you could even, and this is going to sound terrible, but here's the thing, take the County class hull. If you're building County class cruisers, which still, with the rest of it being the same, the County class comes out as a very good design. Take the County class hull and remove the guns and that sort of the armour entirely. Take the superstructure to one side to create an island and put a flight deck on it and a hangar, and have a cruiser carrier, a escort carrier, whatever you want to call it, based off your cruiser class hull. Allow you to use the same power plant, same everything, get the same performance from it, broadly speaking. And you can build those. As many of those as you like, under Washington. Destroyers, torpedo boats, everything. You can build them all. And let's think about this. What is sensible? I would say some large submarines, like the X-1s, are an interesting adaptation. Are they perfect? No. But having a fair number of them is going to be kind of an interesting experience for people, and what succeeds them, who knows? Because, again, if you build them in the 20s, are they going to still be in service in the 40s? Probably, some of them. Maybe the vast majority of them, and that could be a really interesting experience in World War II. Hopefully they don't end up in the Mediterranean, but oh my, could they cause trouble in lots of places. Especially as they can fire their guns almost as soon as they surface their guns. The guns can literally fire at the moment they're out of the water. So, yeah, that's a system which is a system and a half. Especially they link the fire control to the periscope, so you could be zeroed in with your periscope on your target, surface with your 6-inch guns, get out of the water, and boom, 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 4 shells into critical mass. For London, it becomes slightly more complicated, okay? For London, it's sloops, torpedo boats, and auxiliaries. Those are what you can really mass build. I.e. a sloop, which is defined as under 2,000 tons, can't be designed for a speed of greater than 20 knots. Please note that the phrasing, you can tell when the British wrote these things, because it wasn't. We did not design this for a speed of greater than 20 knots. It's supposed to 18.75. It covered this distance in this time. The only way it could do is if it was doing 25, 26 knots. We didn't design it for that speed. It had that speed, but we did not design it for that speed. What its crew can get out of it when they adjust the turbine gearing just right, and they remove the little tab on the boiler, and they, ignite that extra flame. Who knows? But we didn't design it for that, because we designed it with all these things in which stop it doing that. That a chief petty officer and a spanner can remove in about 5 minutes. But we designed it with that, so it couldn't do that speed. We are good people keeping to the letter of the law. And that's legitimately what the British did with sloops anyway, okay? Legitimately, you can do timings of journeys of sloops in transit, and there is no way they can achieve it at their posted top speed of 18 3/4 knots. It just isn't happening. Unless they are doing the 18 3/4 knots on top of a speedboat. Torpedo boats? Well, this is an interesting thing, because if there's an often debate as if the British had started building more of these earlier, does it help with the war? Does it help their security? I think it does help with harbour security. You see, I think sloops like torpedo boats, sloops are primarily used as oceanic escorts and convoy escorts and anti-submarine warfare vessels. So the same with a lot of torpedo boats early on, motor torpedo boats. Motorboats, they're used for anti-submarine warfare work. And if we consider the sheer number of ports, harbours, scarper flow, etc. that need to be patrolled, and sheer number of shorelines around the world need to be patrolled, having more vessels to do that patrolling is not going to hurt. And if you've been building them in peacetime, for a longer advance, you'd had to build up a greater cadre, but also build up a greater cadre of builders of them. The other advantage you could have with torpedo boats and having enough around is they can really supplement defences at key choke points. Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, Alexandria, the Channel. And that's a key part of British defence and security and their global capabilities. It's the fact that they can control these choke points. And finally we have auxiliaries. Now, auxiliaries are even more fun. HMS Unicorn is technically an auxiliary. That's what she's classified and built under. And again, there are limits on her speed and her gun armament, but she's an auxiliary. Now, if you had been more of a security-focused nation, the moment it's come through that you can do that, you should have been building something like that. And again, this is one of the things that we often have to discuss is we talk about the designing process and how quickly they get these things through. The Royal Navy often has ongoing designs ready to go. They often have an ongoing design process. So basically the Third Sea Lord goes, I want this design, or the Sea Lords go, we would like a design for this, and then the Third Sea Lord goes back to the Director of Naval Construction team and goes, that design, that fits the criteria broadly speaking, and we'll give them that design and that design if there are options, but I want them to pick that one. It's good that they have the illusion of choice. Then they go in and they select it. And then you have to go to the Treasury, and that's usually the longer part of the process, getting the Treasury to sign up on the spending. And then you go into the yard, and the yard start building. You get the yard to send them their plans based on your plans, and that is the point at which more changes from the DNC and the Third Sea Lord slip in, because at that point they're past the point of really anyone else overseeing their work. They are in charge of it. Once it's starting building, it's entirely going through their office. So the conceptions and what choices of options the conceptions are chosen by the Third Sea Lord's office. They go to the Sea Lords to select. Then the Third Sea Lord is in charge of getting those selections through the Treasury and through the various various versions of select committees in Parliament. And then the Third Sea Lord is in charge of getting those built by the yards. See what I mean about how the Third Sea Lord has a lot of power and influence in the process? Well, pretty much Unicorn, the moment they start having this auxiliary branch, which is considered large enough for what would in effect be a light fleet carrier, the Royal Navy starts talking about an auxiliary, especially Henderson, who's the Third Sea Lord at the time, that will do that role. And they start having designs and plans. So theoretically, you could have had a Unicorn-like vessel and others, because there are no cumulative limits on auxiliaries of her ilk, in service a lot earlier. Now, that's the honest way to go around this with a security focus. Okay, yes, the auxiliaries are a little less honest, but you can also get fast oilers and other things built earlier. You can get all these things in these torpedo boats and sloops, and there's no restrictions on it. So you can get stuff which can act as force enablers, because if you have a lot of sloops, then that frees up most of your destroyers and other vessels for fleet work, for escorting your carriers, etc. If you have auxiliary carriers in service, then you don't need to use your aircraft carriers, your fleet carriers, for anti-submarine warfare work. It's the same with the cruiser carriers. And the thing is, I would love to see those lighter carriers built, because if those lighter carriers have been built on the Washington Treaty, that's going to lend to a really interesting scenario when it comes to the London Treaty, because closing up the space for the Ryujo and the Japanese attempt to get a full fleet carrying 10,000 tons is going to be made far more difficult. Now you can ask, why did the British not do this? Anyway, they wanted a whole load of cruiser hulls. They didn't build all the cruisers, and they build odd numbers again, ordering 5, etc. Cruisers aren't usually ordered in sort of that sort of number. Ordering 4 and 5, you usually order slightly more. So, and it wouldn't have been sensible to maybe order them in the case of order 4 cruisers. If you're ordering 4, add on a cruiser carrier, or order 6 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 2 hulls in carrier form. So 2 cruiser carriers. That would have made sense. That would have meant that every cruiser squadron, which would usually be about 8 ships in this time administratively, could be made up of 3 gun divisions and 2 carrier divisions. Or 3 gun divisions and 1 carrier division. Sorry. Brain. Now, the point with that, if we work from that, is you have an option. If you have such an availability, and if you do build such groups, let's say you build those ones in order 1924, they'll come into service about 1926, 27, depending on when how they do in trials and commissioning. And that's always the case. The ships you can rush trials and commissioning, but you don't have to in peacetime. So that's when we usually say it's like 2 to 3 years, because you can take time to get things right, and usually as you build more, you get quicker. So 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, probably 29 as well. Maybe you get 30s, but 24, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. Then at 5. So you could end up with 30 such cruisers, 30 county class cruisers in service, and 10 of those little carriers. They'd have similar operating characteristics to a county class cruiser, but that would be really quite useful for the British. Really quite useful. And it's going to have an effect on things. It really would have an effect on things. In terms of cruiser tonnage allowances, but also in terms of how do you approach it. I would suggest in that scenario you end up with a heavy cruiser and a light cruiser category in the London Naval Treaty. You probably end up with a fleet carrier and a cruiser carrier categories. Especially the British call them cruiser carriers. And there'll be a debate as to what the tonnage level is and requirements are for a cruiser carrier. It's quite interesting how it would work out. I can see the Americans going, what do we do here? Because the Americans really like large fleet carriers. But they could also go, well, this could be useful. If it's put as a certain tonnage point, we can push some of our smaller carriers down into that tonnage limitation. So that's going to be where the Americans are probably going to be trying to push up the tonnage limitation, while the British will be trying to keep it down, because they see it as their numbers vessels for their economic warfare, so they want the ships to be as individually small as possible, but numerous as possible. And the Japanese will probably be siding with the Americans, because if they can get this category made of larger ships, then they can maybe get something useful. It would have an impact. Then we have the infrastructure. because you can't do all this without infrastructure. And the thing is, if you're doing that much level of construction, you're going to impact the infrastructure. You're going to be supporting and paying into the infrastructure. But you're also, if you are a security focus, you want to do some more redundancy. For example, one of the things that's often misunderstood is that India does have a lot of railways going across it, including east-west, etc. during the famine. There isn't a railway which stretches all the way, and should be, from Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now called, to Singapore. That was often mooted as a discussion and as a railway to build. Now, there are mountain ranges and various things in the way, and it's not exactly easy terrain. But think about that from the perspective of World War, if you'd built such a railway. You would have a railway connecting up Burma to India, which would be very useful at that point. And there really wasn't a good railway at that time. And you need a solid railway that you can move rice up and down, as well as troops and other garrison forces. And one of the big problems for India at this time is they have a lot of railways which are, and even to this day, which are very good at getting stuff from the centre out. But when you're trying to go across, they're far more limited. From the interior to the exterior, they're good. Or getting back to those points of the interior from the exterior. But trying to get across from exterior to exterior, that's more complicated. And it's not just India. There is Africa. There are lots of places around the world which need infrastructure investments. Beyond what you necessarily want to do for economic reasons. Because let's be honest, in pure economics terms, you don't need to build that railway from Bombay, that's called at the time, but Mumbai today. I'm just adding in both because sometimes people think I don't know that it's changed name, and I'm going, no, it's just I'm talking in the 1920s and 30s. It's like when I used Ceylon, and I'm talking about that. That's because that's what it was called at the time, not because I don't know now it's now called Sri Lanka. I do love the comments like that. I'm sort of going, I'm not being rude. It's what they called it at the time, and I'm talking about in the historic books. And again, this is part of the whole historian thing of trying to get into the mindset of the people making decisions at the time. Sometimes you need to use the phraseology at the time. You know, the words and names of cities, etc. It's kind of useful. Because it's how do you think of them in order. Because if you're talking about it in alphabetical order today, well, Mumbai is quite a long way down the list, but Bombay is quite high up the list. If you're doing it in alphabetical order. So that changes how you approach things. You think, because humans often categorize things in things like alphabetical order, because it's an easy way of organization. Same with Ceylon versus Sri Lanka. Anyway, so the railway from Bombay to Singapore doesn't make much economic sense. You can do it quite easily with ships. They have lots of tramp steamers going around. The Indian Ocean is basically a British lake at this point. Who cares? But think about it from the perspective of the events of 1942, 1941. You want to quickly garrison Singapore. You want to quickly move troops into that area. Well, if you've got a nice railway running around it, it's very easy and very quick to move troops. It's very quick. You load them up on the train. You're not... Because if you think what you probably would do historically, you'd be loading them up onto the train, then taking them from the train to somewhere where there's a ship, offloading them onto the ship would take them to another place, and then they offload from there. This thing, you're just loading them up on the train and running the train. That's all you do. Run the train. That's what the kind of system you want to build. That's going to take investment and time, and it's more than the economic need. It's justified. It's more expensive than the economic potential would justify it. But it's useful. It's the same with Australia, investing in railways out there, and investing in railways in the UK, and investing in railways in South Africa and the rest of Africa. You have to invest in infrastructure, and there is a certain level at which it is economically viable. It's going to pay you back, and you can decide, well, this infrastructure will pay for itself in 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, or 100 years. Sometimes, the thing is, the infrastructure which will pay for itself in 100 years, so it's not usually something which governments want to invest in, is also an infrastructure which, on a security terms, could pay for itself in one war. In one day of one war, because of what the utility it provides. and the difference it makes between victory and defeat. But that is a very different metric than the economics. Very different metric than the economics. But you can justify it on economic grounds. No one was going to sit around Britain in this period and go, well, you know, you're investing in shipyards, you're investing in these port facilities, you're investing in railways, you're investing in roads. Yeah, you're preparing for war. No, we're not. We're growing our economy. We've just come out of the World War One. We've just come out of a Great War, the war to end all wars. We've got all these people who have come out who are now looking for employment, all these people who are looking to be fed, all these people who are looking for a better quality of life than they had before. We're investing in infrastructure. It's basic. If you're not doing it, why not? We're letting the capitalists and the entrepreneurs get on with creating the companies and growing them. We're interfering where we have to, but otherwise we're letting them go. But we're building infrastructure so that it makes everyone's quality of life better. It makes it easier for the industrialists to work. It makes it easier for everyone to do this. It makes it easier for people to find employment or move to where there's employment. It makes it easier for food to get around, for goods to get around. It makes it easier to support the economy we want to build. No one can argue with that. Well, they can try, but it's not going to be a good argument because it's going to make them sound like idiots to their own domestic political audience. In which case, they're probably going to end up going, the British are being cruel to us. Yeah, so what? Now, if you have a security focus, the interesting thing for me, in terms of treaty compliant, is that whilst you're not supposed to put weapons in certain areas of the South China Sea and Pacific, there are very few to no restrictions elsewhere. And for Britain, I think they really lost the trick with this, because I think not only would it have been sensible to go with the 15-inch guns at Singapore, etc., but I think I would go with the etc. More of them. Build more of those guns, or maybe even build up the 18-inch guns. You're not building for the warships anymore. Build them for the land fortifications. And stick 18-inch guns in Gibraltar, in Singapore. And if anyone objects that you have too much firepower, well, if you don't go to war with us, you'll never have to worry about the firepower at Gibraltar, will you? But Gibraltar is a vital naval base for us. Same as Malta. Honestly, these places should have been far more heavily fortified. And not just with the big guns, but also, honestly, it would have been sensible if they'd had 18-inch guns, 9-inch guns, and probably a whole host of 4-inch guns as well for their defences. Build up a standardisation and start putting these weapons out there. Also, around Britain. Scapa Flow should have been invested in. It should have had its concrete causeways and things built definitely in the 1920s, if not the 1930s, as an economic measure to provide people with employment. But also, if you're building these battleship-grade guns but putting them on land fortifications, that's going to keep your gun manufacturers, gun technology going very well, thank you very much. It's also going to provide you with some interesting capabilities. And yes, you probably go, well, Singapore falls, so that's no help. Well, Singapore, if you've got landward fortifications, if you've got a proper fortification plan, if you've got the 18-inch guns there, etc., that's going to present a different target. Yes, it might still fall, but it might not. Add in the railway, add in all these things, and suddenly you can reinforce the garrison. You will probably have the ability to organise things just that tad better. And the big problem, as I've often said, for the British in Burma and in Malaysia is that they have a lot of these defensive positions, places to defend, but they don't have a lot of forces to defend them with. And especially as most of the forces they have are in training or training up, because most of the forces which were at the high level of readiness have been drawn off to go and fight in North Africa, and then the ones which were being trained behind them to defend the area have gone off and fought in Iraq and various other operations over there. And this is the scenario of what's going on. And in East Africa, etc., the forces keep getting drawn off to go and deal with other problems. So realistically, what you needed was as strong a baseline defence as possible in place, so that the forces which were there could fall into those and hold them. Which meant you do need landward fortifications built. Can you hold on to Singapore in a wartime scenario? I don't know. It's honestly going to depend on a lot of factors, because if you've built it properly, it's going to be quite a hard nut to crack. And the thing is, whilst people call it the Malta of the Far East in that scenario, and think about it that way, it's not. Because the problem for Malta was that either way you came to it, you had trouble getting supplies to it. And if you were trying to get supplies to Malta from Gibraltar, you have to fight an absolute gauntlet. If you're trying to get supplies from the Suez to Malta, you have to go the whole way around Africa. Well, here's the thing. Where are most of the supplies for Singapore going to come from? They're going to come from India. And if you've managed to retain control of Singapore, then the opportunities for the Japanese to have stronger presence in the Indian Ocean, as they did historically, becomes far more limited. Add to that, if you have torpedo boats operating from there, sloops operating from there, submarines operating from there, you're going to create a sphere of areas which is going to be complicated for the Japanese to get through, which is going to provide you more of a defensive depth to get those supplies through to Singapore itself. Will it be easy? No. Will it be under siege? Potentially, but also potentially not. Again, think about it from a land artillery perspective. If there are 18-inch guns there, or even 15-inch guns well supplied, with both armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition, and maybe some of the theorized fuel-air explosive ammunition which they were considering, some of the early ideas of things which eventually lead to things, stuff like napalm, etc., were being worked on in this period, and there were ideas for even big guns like that to fire such shells. Then besieging forces could have a very nasty time. But also, if you've been sensible while you've been building up defences, you have put defences through Malaya. You have put defences at various points so that those forces, when they're attacked, can withdraw. And the air bases, especially, it's almost sensible that you include in your airbase design a little space, a little point that someone can go off to and hide in and watch that base from, and call in artillery or airstrikes on there should it be occupied by the enemy. And I know that is absolutely terrible of me to think such things, but that's actually a sensible idea to do and include. And have a party which would disappear from the base to go off and do exactly that. They'd disappear off. They'd have a hidey hole already built out, picked up and secured, somewhere they don't really need to move from, that they can watch the air base from, if it's occupied. Maybe have a hard line going out back down to Singapore, or alternatively having a radio transmitter, but having different positions they can go and transmit from, already worked out. Maybe they even have a telephone line, rather than going back to Singapore, going to a spot where the radio transmission team are, and then they pick it up, and then the team who are doing the transmissions go off to a different place to broadcast from. So revealing one's position won't reveal another's position. And if they have two radio teams they can contact, then Well, then they take it in turns. One day they contact one team, one day they contact another team. The point is, if you're prepared to invest money, you can be treaty compliant, and you can still make the world a living nightmare for people, if you're prepared to invest it. Why do big guns like 15-inch or 18-inch guns at Gibraltar help? Because they seal up the Mediterranean. Give them decent fire control, give them all those things, then honestly, battleships going past are going to have to come in fleet strength or they're not getting past. Especially once you have radar available. You have it on Malta, and that adds another area around Malta where, frankly, convoys cannot go to must fear to tread. And if you think about also the angles you can achieve with a 15-inch or 18-inch gun firing from a land fortification rather than a ship. On a ship, it's usually a maximum of roughly 30-35 degrees when we're talking about these really big ship guns. Talking land, well, they can get up to 45 degrees, and as you all know, when it's firing 45 degrees, that's the longest range a gun can achieve. And from a piece of land, which relatively speaking isn't moving, yes, rotation of the Earth and the fact that the planet's whole solar system, let alone planet, are moving through space, so the planet is moving while moving around. It's first turning itself, and then it's moving around the sun, and the sun is moving all the way through the galaxy of space and all these things. That might be a movement, but that, relatively speaking, as far as the gun is concerned when it's firing its target, is not moving. Because everything else is moving in the same direction at the same way. You could build a series of basically fortified bases around the world. Make sure they're garrisoned, and those are the core points you work from. So when you're building in your infrastructure, when you're building in your fuel silos, when you're building in all the things that you're building to hold supplies and raw material, you fortify them, and you fortify them properly. It works. It's going to be expensive, but it will work. And so, let's consider the summary of this. We haven't even broken the spirit of any treaties here. We have just built within the limits. Now, it would change things. Honestly, as said, if you build those county-class cruiser carriers, that's going to change the phrasing of the London Naval Treaty. These changes will have a cumulative impact. Investments like this always have a cumulative impact. The more you invest, the more you're often able to invest because it boosts the economy, but also it means that when you're, let's say, preparing for World War II, the less money you have to spend in building up these infrastructure at that point, so you've got money for other things you can invest in. There's often a question about when you should invest money in infrastructure. The answer is always now. Because it'll never be cheaper than it is today. And if you invest now, that will give you opportunities for the future. And that will give you options in the future. Not investing tends to just lead to more costs. Later and now, actually. This is a picture of one of the 9.2-inch guns at Gibraltar. Look at that view. Look at what it can see, imagine what it can do from there. Now imagine a 15-inch gun, or an 18-inch gun up there, able to angle up to 45 degrees. Imagine what that could see, what that could do. You might not even put those guns up that high. You might leave it to be the 9.2-inch guns up that high, and you might put the 18-inch guns far lower down the rock. After all, the weight of putting them up there is going to be difficult. Doesn't really matter. With the range they have, that is the Gap covered. That is the Straits of Gibraltar covered. And yes, you're quite right to say that there are rules forbidding the navies from having ships with such size guns. But honestly, when you start going through the rules on the fortifications, the British can get around it because they already have an 18-inch gun in manufacture and in service. They're not developing a new gun, they're just, continuing to use it for its land-based versions. Which is enough to get them around it and get them through. This really gives you a lot more expenses which are hard to justify in the Depression, etc., and things which we know happen. But there's also the argument that the effects of the Great Depression, etc., could be quite significantly lessened if this was the policy being carried out by the government. Because there's going to be that amount of money going through the system. Yes, the government gets the money from taxes. Always true. Government doesn't create money, government gets money from taxation. But because it's providing money through infrastructure and employment, that money is going to be circulating back. A lot of this defence spending is going to be circulating within the wider British economy and the wider British Empire economy. So it's going to feed back into the government probably many times over. And probably pay for itself several times over. And long term, if you're being really sensible economically, if it reduces the costs of World War II, then that's a good thing. And finally, the Treaty Selective. The one we've all been secretly waiting for. Definitely what we've been waiting for, but let's consider the points here. The British have a history of taking an approach to the treaty and reading the fine print, or writing the fine print as they did in the London Naval Treaties, in a way that specifically suits them. That really does suit them, and allows them things like the British developed water as an idea for water as blast protection for dealing with torpedoes, so that's why you get water as armour. Water is, of course, as long as it's for the boilers, is not included in the standard displacement of a vessel, so you can carry as much of it as you like. Water as armour. That's where it comes from. The cannon class fitted for, but not with, those 4-inch arm plates, which, when they appeared, then the county class hull just rides so right in the water. It's really amazing. Require nothing to be taken off the ships, and it just installs, and then they ride completely correctly in the water. And going from looking at that quite high, quite prominent vessels, to being far more naturally looking like cruiser hulls in British cruiser history. It's not as if they'd been designed, everything weights calculated with the 4-inch armour belt in, and then they just took the armour belt out and stored it in a warehouse somewhere. And we've also talked already about the sloops. As long as they're not designed to exceed a speed of 20 knots, that's fine. If they do, well, chiefs happen, but they weren't designed to go faster than 20 knots. How did we know that the chief petty officer, the first thing they would do when they saw that the turbine gearing, would go, "That's a speed limiter on my ship. Don't even need to consult the captain on this one. Get that off now." How was anyone supposed to know a chief would do that? And pretty much every single chief on every single... It was almost the first command, it seems to be, on almost every single chief on every single sloop. Almost without fail. And and that's... How do I put this? That's not written down anywhere. You can't find a written record of that. That's in accounts passed down that I've heard from people who are involved, and it's very much a case of, I'm sure no officer was ever asked whether or not those things would be removed. No chief would ever be stupid enough to ask an officer on that scenario. As long as they didn't ask an officer and the officer didn't ask the questions, no one cared. The officer would know it's gone, the engineering officer, but they wouldn't know because the chief hadn't officially told them, so they wouldn't have to tell the captain, so the captain wouldn't have to tell anyone. So as far as the Admiralty was concerned, they were treaty compliant. Now, there are lots of little things like that go around, and you can do a lot of stuff with that. But let's move on from there. Let's think, what do you do in this scenario? So, sloops, again, are the naval construction equivalent, but there's a lot of things you can do with sloops. The fact is, the same hull which is used for the sloops, for the Egret class, and there's a reason I like to use their pictures, and the Bittern class is also used for the Hunt class, and escort destroyers, and for the Black Swan class sloops. It's the same hull. It's modified a bit, stretched a bit, those sort of things, but it's the same hull design. Which tells you something when you consider the speeds the Hunt class were clocked at doing. Officially. And the Black Swans were occasionally clocked at doing. Unofficially. It tells me that if I designed this hull right, that I could maybe, I don't know, fit in an extra couple of boilers. Maybe there was space for them. Then I could possibly get this ship up to speeds which would make it a very fine destroyer. And if I designed it like I designed my county class cruisers, for a torpedo launcher, maybe a single quad launcher or a quintuple launcher, but didn't fit them, just happened to have a load of spare ones for destroyers I already have in service sitting in a warehouse, because of course I have spares. See the number of destroyers I have? And I need spare launchers sitting around. You can go further. We've already talked about the auxiliary carriers and the cruiser carriers and all of those systems. You can really push things if you want to. If your concern is not about economic growth, not about security, but about having the strongest navy possible to deal with potential threats, so you're basically overwriting it, you can go down some really interesting routes. Under the Washington Treaty, remember, there's no cumulative limits below capital ships and carriers. So as long as it's below 10,000 tons, you can build as many as you want. As many as you want. The British could have, if they'd wanted to, could have been ordering 12 of those county class cruisers and 4 of those carriers a year. It would have been expensive. It would have meant you would have to slow the paying back of the national debt. Not by much, but by something. And admittedly, you'd have spread these things across the empire, across the dominions. But you could have done that easily. And then, what do we have when you get to the London Naval Treaty? Well, Britain's got, by the looks of things, 60 brand new cruisers. And what? 20 of these small carriers running around? The treaty will have to be adjusted to deal with it. What the London Treaty will then say is open to debate, but there'll have to be a response. Will America bat an eyelid to it? No, because... And consider this simply. The Americans consider the battle fleet above all else in terms of their political. See, their navy will bat an eyelid, will bat some eyelids. I don't really look at it, but their Senate government, the Senate and High government will go, well, yes, but that doesn't matter. The British need them to patrol their empire and do what they do, which we don't like. We're not really going to deal with. No, we have a battle fleet which can match them. Our battle fleet can sweep those aside, and they probably could. But let's be honest, if you've got that as your presence force around the world, doing trade protection and presence, etc., it is going to allow the British capital ships and fleet carriers to really concentrate on what they're doing. Which is also going to change the calculations and numbers of things. And you can't really turn around to the British and go, those sloops you're building, they don't have enough boilers in them. What are you talking about? Well, there's space where a boiler would go there. No, as you can see, there's a water tank. We carry more water for long distance cruising. It's a water tank or it's a fuel tank. You can't... That's a legitimate reason. You and your architects will know that is an absolute twaddle, that is space for another boiler to go. But you can't prove it, because there is something legitimate sitting there. That they can quickly remove, but there is something legitimate sitting there. And that's a problem. Because again, if Britain's been investing in infrastructure, if Britain's investing in the necessary yards it needs and facilities it needs to do that stuff and to support that all, well, then it'll be able to do the work. And there is other stuff. If you're investing in yards and infrastructure, which we'll be getting onto in a second, what we do in this scenario. Now, the British do invest in our merchant cruisers. They are quite shameless and still doing this practice in this period of paying the shipping companies to fit their merchant ships out so they can be turned into armed merchant cruisers. That's part of Britain's economic warfare policy. That's part of Britain's trade protection policy to have these. That's why they have guns sitting around that they can mount onto merchant ships. That's why they have an entire doctrine. That's why they have a team in the Admiralty, in Director of Naval Construction, looking at these things and looking at this scenario. We'll take that a step further. The Japanese do. Why not the British? You can have even more aircraft carriers. You can pay for even more fast oilers. You can pay for all sorts of things. Again, the Americans do the same thing with fast oilers and oil tankers. You don't need them all in peacetime. So you can set up agreements that you'll fund the difference to make them faster, etc., to shipping companies, in return for having the ability in wartime to hire them and take them over. To convert them into aircraft carriers, to convert them into what you need. And again, this is all a grey area as far as the treaty is concerned, because technically you're not supposed to be doing some of these things, but the things you are allowed to do can cover for you doing the things you're not supposed to do. And things can be worded and work so well that the number of people who know what the reality is can be a very small group of people. And they're very loyal. And everything will have plausible deniability. And that's the point when you're doing this on this scale. When you're a government, it's plausible deniability. It's not keeping it secret. There's too many people involved. Yeah, but we have a reason for that. We're putting a fuel tank there. Yeah, we have a reason for that. This ship is going to be fast because it's going to be. We would like to pay for the speed because we know we're going to need some armed merchant cruisers are going to need to help us in the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean in any wartime because we have to focus on the Italians in the Mediterranean or the Japanese in the Far East. So we need to be able to replace our warships on those patrols. So that we need some which are fast to catch up with fast surface raiders. That's very legitimate. The fact that the reality is, no, that one's going to be converted into a carrier, we'll leave to one side. Doesn't matter. There is a very legitimate reason you could be doing this. Yes, it's not the reason you're actually doing it, but that doesn't matter. What matters is, no one can argue that your reason, your stated reason, is not legitimate. You have plausibility. You have deniability. And this leads us to the infrastructure thing. If I'm being selective on my infrastructure, and selective on these things, in terms of defences, then I have to start thinking about those islands and spaces which are in the Pacific as well as the islands everywhere else. Yes, I can fortify everywhere else quite happily. But what's my fortification plan for the Pitcairns and other key points? First of all, I have to decide whether they're worthwhile defending. If I'm going with a policy of every bit of British soil should be defended, every part of the British Empire should be defended, then I've got to come up with a way to defend them. Now again, I have a lot of guns in storage as the British. I could store a lot more. What's the stuff which is going to be difficult for me to have on those islands which creates fortifications? Well, if I'm doing some building work on those islands, I could be making concrete foundations and some concrete structures, because that's the easy material to bring in, and that's what I'm building, breeze block, concrete, those sort of things. Yeah, I can do that, and that's just legitimate construction of infrastructure and of port facilities. The fact that I build the port facilities so that, let's say, there's ready ammunition supply spaces, etc. But those are storage points for port goods, port materials, rope blockers. Where are the guns, you're going to say? Well, let's say they're sitting in a nice dockyard in Sydney. Nicely stored in the Royal Navy warehouse there. Threat of conflict comes out. Merchant ship is in the port. Loaded up. Takes it out there. Some engineers from the Royal Navy Mobile Basing Units, the Royal Marines, get off, and they set up the fortifications on the pre-planned sites. And they have ammunition. And what do you need there to make that work? Well, you need probably a little railway. You need a light railway to get that can take stuff from the port to the ammunition dump, and can also take stuff from the ammunition dump to the various gun batteries. So you need a light railway wandering around the island. Well, that's always a nice thing. We're British, we like to build railways. Of course, made a railway. That's how we were getting the stuff out of the plantations. We used railways all over the empire to get stuff from the farms to the ports. Oh, we used to always use tracks and carts. Yes, but that's not reliable. And frankly, we wanted something which was wood burning, because we didn't want to have to take petrol there all the time for vehicles. And well, a steam train is wood burning. A little steam train is wood burning. There you go. Done. There's an entirely legitimate reason for it. I don't see why you're so worried or stressed about it. I don't see what your fear is. Oh, they made the sleepers out of concrete. Well, again, do you want them to rot in the jungle, in the tropical weather patterns? No, we don't. We build our railways properly. We're British. We've been building railways for centuries. At this point. What are you talking about? Of course we're going to build them properly. That is the thing you're projecting. So you start thinking about this empire, about this trade, and one of the things you also start to realise if you're British is that you have, thanks to all the information you have on the trading, of having the large mercantile fleet you have, of all the trade supplies, you know where all the trade is going and coming from. And here's the other thing. You're not supposed to build. You might not be supposed to build these defenses, but can you get other nations to build these defenses? Are there maybe members of the Empire, but that's more difficult because that's included in the treaty. But what about nations which aren't part of the Empire? The few independent nations around here, around this part of the world. Can you get there? Can you sponsor them to build up defenses that you can, for their own protection, in this needs occupy? For example, Crete. It's kind of a useful position. Now, admittedly, that's with a little bit of historical looking back, but also when you're looking at time data, it's quite an historical position. It's quite a useful position to back up Malta. And again, Crete with a little railway on it to go around the island, and maybe some other things so that, you know, if you needed to quickly occupy it, you could. You start looking around the world, look at where the vital trade goes, where your vital things are, and look at how to secure them. For Singapore, there are lots of little islands, and, well, Bantam Island, etc. is a good example, but also Sumatra itself is not far away. And honestly, again, if you're going to be thinking about reinforcing Singapore and maybe having to deal with that being under siege, perhaps you want to make sure that you can easily secure and protect Karimbesar Island or another of the islands, so you can provide further defensive depth and protection for any convoys coming in. And you think how you approach those areas. Do you make sure that you encourage and incentivize British companies to set up business and operations on those islands, to set up ownership so that they have the controlled land? Do you invest in those companies building facilities, building, let's say, little railways? There are lots of ways to do this with plausible deniability if you're prepared to spend the money. And again, the whole thing of this is if you're prepared to spend the money. Now, what you have to remember, though, and this is one of the things which comes back to why this doesn't happen historically, is British governments have often had the tendency and had the focus since the Napoleonic times that the first thing you do after a war is you disarm you not necessarily disarm, you wind down your armed forces as much as possible and pay back your debts as quickly as possible to maximize your ability to take on more debt for any future crisis. That's how the British governments tended historically to work. The thing was, when you're dealing with the scale of debt of World War I, i.e. the Great War, versus the Napoleonic Wars, that's when that policy doesn't necessarily make sense. Or rather, you have to adapt a longer term policy, because no matter how much you cut stuff, you are not paying this back within the next decade. 10-year rule makes sense if you can pay back the debt in 10 years. If you can't pay back the debt within 10 years, you can't afford the 10-year rule. Or rather, you shouldn't be using paying back the debt as justification for the 10-year rule. You need to think closely about your security. Because if your debt is going to take 60, 70 years to repay, you need to start thinking, well, odds are in that time period we are going to have to face these issues, so is it better we take 70 years to pay back and I do this, or is it better we take 60 years to pay back and I do this? I don't do that. That sort of thing. That becomes the question. So that then leads us to fortifications and garrisons, because infrastructure, it's one thing, but fortifications and garrisons, well, we've passed the security level. We're now on to beyond that. At this point, with fortifications and garrisons, you have to start thinking about things like Hong Kong and Weihai. You're never going to be able to defend them against Japan. The British knew that. The British were predicting Wei Hai Wei has no defences and would go completely. And Hong Kong would also. But the thing is, again, if you consider the state of China at the time, are you prepared to fund the Chinese to defend those places? Are you prepared to fund the Chinese to defend those places for you? As in, to set up fortifications, not looking over so they are prepared, not so you're paying for the Chinese to be able to besiege your forces, but paying and supporting, make sure the Chinese are supplied so that they can provide an outer layer of defense around those bases. So anyone who wants to attack them has to first go through those. And that wouldn't be you building those defences, but, if the Chinese happen to set up a coastal defence fort somewhere on the Shandong Peninsula, not Wei Hai Wei, of course, which has 15-inch guns that you sold them, or 13.5-inch guns you sold them from the battleships you're deactivating, that's not your fault. It's merely you sold them these guns and sent them engineers to help them install them correctly and train them in how to use them. But, that was just good business. That wasn't you being bad. You have all these old battleship guns to get rid of. That's not you being nasty to the Japanese. There's also other scenarios you can look at around the world. If you're prepared to be subtly interventionist to strengthen your own position, you can really start to affect things. You can truly start to affect things. And again, if you look around all the world, all the different British positions, I know 13 colonies on there and that wasn't exactly part of Britain at this point, but Britain can dream. I do love the British Empire in Wikipedia page. You can help by expanding this page. all it would take is one bad tea supply, one of the tea deliveries being paused. The world would not want to be there. But again, you look around all this. If the British are prepared to start investing in all of these, in putting bases in all of them for aircraft to go off and do air searches from, to reinforce and fortify them, to have defense, have infrastructure and protect and garrison them. It costs money, yes. It's also going to provide a large amount of safety for the British forces around the world. Because suddenly there's going to be a scenario of, well, if I'm an enemy surface raider and I'm after British merchant ships can skip from here to here to here, and these are protected points they're going to be protected in. It makes my job a lot more difficult. If I'm a submarine which surfaces too close to a port, boom, 6-inch shells raining down on me. Because the radars detected me and because they've got 6-inch shells on 9.2-inch shells. 9.2-inch high explosive landing close to a submarine is not a good experience for the submarine. A lot of 9.2-inch landing close to a submarine, really not a good experience. So treaty selective is probably where you get the most interesting things come about. And again, you can take the treaty selective quite a long way. Ark Royal, that flight deck is her strength deck, which means you could mount armor on it. So you could have designed a strength deck like you designed the Illustrious class. And you could have just done like you did with the Illustrious class and done a county class and just had the armor ready to fit on top of it. the thing that's often complained about about Ark Royal is, like a lot of carriers of her generation, she sacrifices some of her torpedo defenses. Well, fix that. And mostly, though, the most important thing about her is that you should remember is that she's worn out in war. The reason why she's in the state she is, condition-wise, when she's lost, damage control errors notwithstanding, is because of the lack of experienced damage control officers for aircraft carriers who've learnt that everything you're taught on other ships is wrong on an aircraft carrier because aircraft carriers are so top heavy. Everything you learned on other ships water is the last thing you only let water in when you have to. Water is for the enemy to let in, not you, and all those things. No, with an aircraft carrier you start cannon flooding immediately because they are so top heavy. Your entire mantras, that damage controls live by, are wrong when it comes to a carrier. Would have been learnt by a far larger pool of people if you'd had all those small county class carriers built, because all of them would have been would have produced officers who had that experience. And then if you add in those, and you add in, let's say, some merchant ships, which are merchant cruisers, which turn out to be our merchant carriers when they're converted, well, suddenly you have a lot more ships running around for patrol duties, for convoy escort duties, for those sort of constabulary duties for the aircraft carriers, allowing the fleet carriers like Ark Royal to concentrate on fleet carrier duties. And also, when she does go off to operations, maybe she has a couple of those with her. And yeah, they can maybe only carry 18 aircraft each, and they're, let's say they're 18 swordfish. But that's still useful. Yeah, Ark Royal might be the only one carrying fighters out of the group, or maybe they're each carrying 12 swordfish and 6 sea gladiators. Doesn't matter. Those are going to be extra carriers, extra aircraft to launch a strike. And every little bit has an impact. And yeah, maybe sometimes instead of Ark Royal, you send a couple of them. Or when you're doing the attacks on various points of Italy to draw their attention away from the Taranto attack, well, you've suddenly got a load of fast little carriers to drop off little pinprick attacks. Maybe some of those also join in Taranto. Who knows? The whole point is, if you've done this, if you've gone through with constructing at the very limits you're able to construct to, and taking a very much, well, this is what we've built to the letter of the law, but not to the spirit, because we can quickly revise it, then you've built yourself a very different fleet. But again, the thing is, if you do that with the construction, you have to have the yard and infrastructure facilities that allow you to do that rapid changeover. You need those facilities built up. So you need to be investing in those facilities as well for the entire time. And I hope this has given you a lot of ideas and food for thought. There isn't a traditional summary slide on this video because, as said, I want you to go away and think about these options, and I want you to think about what the British Empire really did, and I want you to think about what other nations did. Whether they took a treaty compliant and just went straight down the treaty approach, whether they took an economic focus within the treaty compliancy, whether they took a security focus, or whether they took a selective focus, or whether they mixed and matched, depending on who was in power and what they were passionate about at the time. Thank you for watching. Now, pneumonia recovery schedule. I have got 2 videos, Conception Operation, the Supercarrier as a Specialist, and the Conception Operation Conclusion of Invincible and Kiev classes, which are, hopefully, if the videos all upload, going to go live tomorrow night and Saturday night. This is supposed to go live on the Thursday night, so it's going to be Friday and Saturday. And then I know this was supposed to be next week, and the Angenor Drone and Fleet Carrier Doctrine was supposed to be this week, but I've spun them around because, honestly, I couldn't find decent photographs for the other one. And I've now found decent photographs, but this is a 2-hour-long video, and I'd already recorded it, so that's fun. But no, we're slowly keeping to the schedule and slowly getting to these things, and we have... Also, this means we won't have 2 alternate histories in a row, which is something I try to avoid, because I know some people really don't like them, and honestly, I get just bored with the comments of people going, I don't like alternate histories. Fine. Good. There are many histories on the channel to go watch. Please go enjoy them. Or go watch another video channel, another YouTube channel. There is a whole world out there. Yes, I'm trying to reach 15,000 subscribers by Christmas. Yes, I really want to get more subscribers. But that doesn't mean I'm going to turn down what my patrons are asking for, because they're the very nice people who fund my research. And part of the implicit contract there is always the case of, if I put this out as an option, you suggest the topics, and then you vote on which topics we do, and then as I do those topics, I don't go, no, I don't feel like doing that this time. No, that's not the way it works. That's not polite. So, as I said, if you want to, its suggestions have gone live for November. Go and suggest different topics, and vote when they come to vote. That's always a good fun. Now, at the moment, I always do admit what I'm fundraising for. At the moment, I'm fundraising, raising all money comes to me is not actually technically going on books or normal research funding, because I'm not really moving much with recovering from pneumonia, etc., from the new home. But I do need a lot of IKEA bookshelves because of the pneumonia. And so all the money raised, all the money I'm raising, super chat, super thanks, Patreon, everything, is going towards bookshelves. When I say all the money, I mean the vast majority of money. Some of the money is still going on Iron Brew, but we'll leave that to one side. You expect some of the money to go to Iron Brew, so I don't feel that's too bad. But no, I need, and I found out to get a delivery from IKEA, I need to be ordering at least 500 quid worth. And so my plan is to break up the total order into 2 orders, because there's no way I will get to the roughly £1,000 I need for the full order before this month. This month. So putting in money from my other earnings and putting in whatever money I get from Patreon and YouTube, I hope to be able to order about half that and get it delivered, hopefully to my home. Then get the stuff set up, and then you will see these boxes go down behind me dramatically, because for every two sets of shells, I get rid of 9 boxes. And if I look beside me, if I can get 6 sets of shells delivered, which is roughly 360 quid, I can get all these boxes gone. There's always still a couple of boxes actually. No, if I can get 8 shells delivered, which is 480 quid, then I can get rid of all the boxes of books in this left around me. Oh, frigate. Oh. Now, someone actually asked me the other day if I have a problem. I said, no, I don't. I just have it's a case of other people have got various other addictions in life. Mine is buying books and using them. I do use them for my work, so they're justifiable. My accountant agrees with me. She's very good. And so then I promised also to talk about building a home network, because I am. That's what I'm planning on doing, and this will be, well, roughly about, I think at current prices, and it's these free, then the microphone's also there, because I decided I'm going to get a freestanding boom to stop the, or hopefully, sorry, when I put my hand down on the thing, or when I put my glass down, yeah, hopefully it stops that. So sort of those are on my list, but these things are. My plan is to build the network myself. There's a very nice gentleman who's going to help me by tugging the cables through and helping route the cables, but I'm going to do all the wiring and all those things, because I can do all that. I've got my certifications. I've got a fairly decent Netgear one. I have to admit, the reason I've picked that one, and people are going to say, well, they've got their own personal choices. One of my cousins bought one of those, and another one's bought one, and another one's bought one, and we ended up with about 3 cousins all have them. They're all very good standalone, and they work quite happily, and so as the family has them, and I know they work, that's what I've gone with, rather than... I've read through reviews, looked at things, and there seemed to be muchness, but a 16-port system seemed to be enough, because we'll use 12 of those ports, and at least 4 free for future expansion. Because, and that's the reason I've got these systems here, because the plan is I'm going to set up the internet and the router and the switch, which is a network switch. It's an unmanaged network switch, so it sorts itself out. It runs itself. Okay, so it's perfect for a home network. And I need roughly 4 ports in my office. My sister needs 4 ports in her office, one for laptop, 1 for PC, 1 for a wireless disk system, and 1 for printer. So that's your 4 ports in each of the offices, and so I need those running. So that's why I've got 4 of those. So I've got the room the internet's that comes into the router and the switch are going to be in. It's going to be in the same room, sitting next to each other. So then they're going to have a nice close distance. There's going to be 2 cables connecting the switch to the router. The reason I'm doing that and add 2 cables is because with the BT routers, I found that produces a better response when I've set that up in the past. I realise it's not always necessary, and it's not always advisable to do that with all routers. But with the BT ones I have, because we have BT, British Telecom internet, that works best for us. And yeah, I've got Cat7 cable. Now the reason I've gone for Cat7 is because of the shielding. Not because the distances we are involved in, the speed doesn't really matter, but the shielding does, and the difference in pricing means that the shielding is sensible, because this is an older house which we modernised. It's got multiple different electrical cables running through it. It's got various systems which I need to fix at certain points, and it's got multiple sort of interesting quirks going on there. We've installed a new... Well, we've had to install entirely new circuits for some of the systems we've added in already. So it just seems more sensible to go for the cable which has the best shielding. And Cat7 cables usually have the best shielding. They also can take up to 600 Hz, which doesn't really matter at the moment with what we're doing in a moment. But in terms of potential future for data carriage in cables, could have an impact. Wasn't really a factor of my thinking at this point, but yeah, I was going for the shielding. So yeah, I'll be wiring up plugs, or rather the sockets, with the Cat7 cable, connecting them all up, and then we'll have the lovely systems working in Netgear. And probably I will buy, to connect the router up and the router up to the cables, some Cat8 cables, because they're very fast over short distances. Very, very fast. And that just gives me the best fidelity. Or I might leave it at Cat7 cables. I might make my own little cables to connect them up. Probably will end up making my own little cables. I've got my full kit. Where is it? There it is. So, for those of you who've been watching this channel for a while will know that I was... many moons ago, an IT technician, systems primarily. Did a bit of network work, and so unsurprisingly, I have some very interesting equipment in my tool cases, including the full kit, which I've used a few times in my life to fix cables, do cable circuitry. Mount new heads onto them, cut them and set them up. And so, yes, building this myself. It also saves money, because usually in the UK you pay an electrician to come in and do it, and it costs a lot of money. So if you can do it yourself, it's quite sensible. There are some good YouTube channels and YouTube videos for it, and tutorials. I always recommend, if you're going to learn how to use it, buy some Cat 6 cable, not Cat 7 or Cat 8. Cat 5 SE is usually fairly good, but Cat 6 cable is usually the easiest, cheapest to buy, and the easiest to train your skills with. And then just practice on that, and then decide what's best for you. If you're doing long distances, again, Cat 7 is usually good for longer distance. Most homes are Cat 6, Cat 5, occasionally SE, but that's going for the cheaper option. And whilst that can work short term, long term, you're probably going to end up wanting to rip it out and replace it with Cat 6. Cat 7 is good if you're in an older house which has a lot of weird electronics running around it that you might need shielding from, so you don't want to interfering and degrading your signal, but you have to be prepared to pay for that. Cat 8 is what we may... if someone is telling you Cat 8 for your home usage, tell them to bog off, excuse the French. It's very good if you're working in a data center, if you've got a full network hub system going with all the server racks and all those things. Yeah, Cat 8 will do for those distances, but you really don't. Once you're in dealing with anything over... Someone's told me 30 meters, but in my experience it's usually about 20 meters. Cat 6 is just as good as Cat 8 and about half the price, if that. But again, your differences depend on, to an extent, your own personal selection, but also what you want to do with it. Mine is very much a case of, I need to secure these things. I need to make sure they're safe. I need to make sure they're reliable. And that goes through my selection of them, which is why I tend to select stuff which is not necessarily as fancy, not with the fancy apps and other integrations, but is very reliable. My view has always been it's better to buy basic rather than economy. When people buy stuff which is cheap, it often is cheap. It might seem to look like all the bells and whistles, but those tend to break rather quickly. Whereas if you buy something which is basic, which might not have the bells and whistles, but is otherwise a very solid design and is proven and works, it will tend to be reliable and work for you for a while. And what did I want for switch? What did I want for cable? What did I want for the network? I wanted something which was going to work. That was it. That's the criteria. So yeah, this will be 300 and something odd pounds. I think it's roughly 320 quid once I put it all together and I've put it all in, because actually it's 320 including the boom mic, but it's going to be roughly that much, mainly because I'm buying 200 meters of cable. And that's usually quite fun when people go, what are you buying 200 meters of cable? Well, think about it, I'm going that way and down. It's going to mostly run through the roof and come down, and so I need to do that roughly 8 times over. And then I have another 2 ports off in the TV room, which also goes around down and is actually below the room it's going to come in. And you start to realise that 200 meters goes goes quite quickly once you're doing, well, 8 times, if I'm lucky, about 18. That is, measuring it up, I'm going to mentally round it up to 20 in my head, but 18 is what it is at a minimum in terms of distance it's got to carry. So that's 144 meters worth, and then we've got about another 2 sets of 12, so that's another 24, which is about 168 meters worth, and that leaves me 32 meters spare, which sounds like a lot, but as anyone who's ever done laid a network in their house will tell you, that can disappear in 5 minutes flat, and then you're going, we're buying another 100 meter spool. In fact, honestly, if I did find myself with a spare 90 quid, I would be ordering 300 meter spools. Because, let me put it this way, you will never complain about having more cable. And I would prefer not to have to splice cables together in the middle of the cable to make it up. So I want to try and use single sets of cable between the points. It could well leave me with some offcuts, which I could cut up into making little smaller cables for the networking itself in terms of from the ports to where the computers are, but we'll see about that. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting, I hope you found that useful extra stuff, and thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed today's video. What else we got coming up? Let's go back to this one, because we've got the Supercarriers and Specialists and the Invincible and the Kiev classes coming out, and then it's going to be another Brood Ships on Sunday, which I'm sure there are lots of people sending me Kalaxs suggestions for Kalaxs-themed titles for Brood Ships, because that's pretty much what it's raising money for. Thank you very much for watching, take care, and hope you enjoyed.